On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Steve Van Lare. He is the Vice President of Engineering at Anjuna Security. We're going to be talking about what happens when you hire an outside technology leader into your company. So obviously there might be a need and a time when a company has to go outside their internal channels or promotion and hire an outside engineering or technology leader. There's a lot of implications, a lot of impacts. We're going to be talking about what those mean, the relationship with the existing leadership, how somebody needs to approach this, and build some of those relationships that are super important. Steve, thanks for coming on the show to talk about this with us.
Hey, my pleasure, Amir. Looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Before we start, tell everyone what you guys do at Anjuna Security.
Happily. So every time there's a new change to the CPUs, new opcodes, you need a software layer to abstract that to make it easy to take advantage of. So our founder was getting his PhD over at Stanford in cryptography, and the subject of confidential computing came up, and that was the foundation of the business. So we are building the infrastructure layer that you need to support confidential computing anywhere, in the cloud, on-prem, wherever you happen to want to run it.
Awesome. Well, I think that seems like that'd be an interesting episode in of itself. This one, we're talking about obviously what happens and when do you hire a technology lead from outside the company? Obviously, companies have different states, different growing needs and objectives, but there are times when a company has to bring in somebody, a technology leader. We could talk about even different levels of seniority within leadership, but they do have to hire somebody from the outside. What are some circumstances that would prompt a company to have to go outside to hire a technology leader?
In my experience, companies go outside when they're generally unhappy with what's being produced by the organization. If somebody leaves, somebody retires, if they've done a good job, there's a succession plan in place, and you don't need to look outside. You tend to look outside when you think, for whatever reason, the organization just isn't delivering on what's to be expected. So I joined one organization in my career when they lost their head of engineering. They went through a series of CEOs, and as one of the CEO transitioned, a lot of the executive staff walked out the door, and they were trying to manage what they were doing, but they weren't producing much in terms of output. The team was very big on Scrum, and so you don't finish a sprint until all the work is done. And so they had started a 3-week sprint, and 6 weeks later, they were still working on that 3-week sprint. 3 weeks after that, they were still working on that 3-week sprint. When I was hired, they were still working on that 3-week sprint. And so those are, somebody is looking to make a change. The organization, for some reason, feels the path they're on it needs to be shaken up.
It's interesting because I think, sometimes those factors could be, as you mentioned, do you need to shake things up? When you do bring in that person from the outside, obviously, if you're working in the company and let's say, for this example, you're a director of engineering, there's a couple of director of engineerings, and all of a sudden somebody's brought in as a VP of engineering. That's sometimes difficult, I guess, for a director of engineering to see, just because obviously everyone is, for the most part, hoping to move up the career ladder. When you do see somebody come in from the outside and you're on the inside and you're thinking, hey, I might strategically be moving up to that particular role, talk to us a little bit about the implication of that hire on the internal people.
Obviously, the internal people are going to be upset. I've been on both sides of this equation where I've had people brought in to an organization that I was in, and you've got to adapt to that, as well as been brought in as that person who is being brought in to shake things up. Internally, yes, right? If you think you're ready for that position and somebody is brought in that role, there's no way for that not to sting and not hurt when that happens. And whether that ends up being a long-term sting or a short-term sting, that depends on the relationship that then gets built.
And you know what's maybe something that you can help explain, and maybe it's slightly outside the context of the conversation, but I think somebody might be curious. I'll ask. I mean, if you see somebody brought in as a VP of engineering, right, and obviously they're used to having multiple directors report to them, and as a director of engineering, I'm thinking, I am looking to level up. I can get to that next level. Typically, when you do see that leader brought in from the outside, what's the implication there to the actual talent there? Because I think the mindset to me is, well, you don't have that experience, which might be true, or you're telling the person, I don't think you have maybe the ability to manage up, or we need someone who can manage directors and you're used to managing managers or an actual team executing. When you kind of look at that and you look at the bar between, let's say, an outside hire and inside hire, how does the new manager go about explaining that component? Is it their job, or is it that, hey, you just accept it? Because that seems like that, it's not always a big gap.
I don't think it's necessarily even a reflection of the individuals. This is where there's no way, if it happens to you, there's no way for it not to be perceived that way. But let's say the executive team is unhappy with what's being produced by the development organization. They tend not to want to promote from within because the within is already not producing. And so there's kind of this momentum that happens to pull somebody in from the outside and find a different path, to find a different way forward. And when that happens, it's like most things in life, most change. It can be good change, it can be bad change. It's just change in its own right. And the question is, what is going to happen to me as we move forward? If I'm ready to move up and they don't push you into that position, but they bring somebody else, is there something to learn to accelerate that maybe somewhere else, or maybe in the same company because the company is growing, which is why they're bringing somebody on board? I had a position at one point in my career. I was vice president of engineering. I had come in through an acquisition, and the organization had been through a tough time, and they wanted to make a change. So what they ended up doing is they created an SVP role, and they brought an SVP into the position. And what they did was look at what the organization was. We worked on what some changes might be appropriate in the organization. And that change ultimately led to me being a VP of engineering at Oracle, where I ran the whole group. So it was a good thing for me. It was a time for me. Obviously, I felt I could have done the role at that point, but it was a time for me to really kind of round out my skill sets from somebody else, which made me far more ready when the next acquisition happened and the next change happened.
Interesting. Yeah, I think from what I'm hearing, and obviously case by case, obviously this can be wildly different for everyone, and every circumstance is different. So we are generalizing, but it does seem like if you're in that growth trajectory and you do want to move ahead, you will be potentially on both sides of this at one point of your career. And I think obviously when you're brought in, there's a certain depth and understanding of how to handle it. If you're in a position where you're lower down and somebody's hired above you, that's going to sting, as you mentioned. And I guess when you come in from the outside, knowing that there will be differing opinions, right, depending on how big or small that team is that you're managing, as a leader, what are things you do to help ensure that you are going to remove any friction, or just make sure that it's just as smooth a path as you can possibly have?
So when I've been brought in, the first thing I want to do is meet everybody and really get a sense for how the organization is going. And so that's an opportunity to then anybody who, kind of wanted that job, it's an opportunity to influence. Glad you're here. wish the following things were happening, and ultimately be blunt about what your aspirations are and where you want to be. In my very first startup, we acquired another company, and they brought in somebody more senior than I was. And I probably didn't handle it as best as I could. This is the first time this had really happened to me in my career on one side or the other. But after a series of conversations, both with the new VP as well as with the CEO, the decision we ended up with was I was going to stick in the position, and they helped the VP that we acquired get a nice transition plan into his next role. And in that particular case, the CEO wanted to continue investing in the founder and the knowledge base that I brought. And it wasn't, they were looking for a new VP. It happened that they brought one in as part of an acquisition, and there were options on the table to figure out what to do with that. So having open and honest conversations help in this conversation. Can also help in a negative way, right? If you're going to be oil and water with the person that comes in, nobody's going to be happy. And knowing that sooner rather than later is a good thing to know, because the path you thought was there may no longer be there, in fact. And you just make the call at that point.
And, you know, I was actually thinking about this. This decision's made, obviously, from above the existing leadership, right? I mean, obviously, this is a decision coming up from higher. It could involve, you know, the CTO, the CEO, depending on, again, size of the organization. A lot of different people will be involved in the decision. Hey, we need to bring in a leader on the engineering team from the outside. I guess maybe one question, and this may be a tricky one, but when you are, and I don't know if you've been a part of the conversations, right? If you haven't, obviously, then, you know, this question's myth. But, you know, when people are deciding that new leadership is needed, how do they inventory that? Who are they speaking to? Because obviously, you know, that's tricky, right? I mean, I'm trying to think about both sides and all sides, and I'm like, you know, they're looking at it from they're looking from top down, and they're evaluating, and they might be doing some, you know, bottom up evaluation as well. But how are they evaluating that? Oh yeah, we definitely need an outside talent to come in to do this particular leadership function.
It varies. I think I've only been involved in it a couple of times, so I think it's dangerous to generalize. There's the famous quote that all heavens look the same, but every hell is unique and personal. You know, I had a friend call me up not too long ago and asked me to do an evaluation of their business and their VP of engineering, and say, we think they're ready for the job, but there's these things that aren't getting done. And so I was brought in as a coach. And the goal in that particular case was, can they upskill the VP that they had? And if not, they were going to go find someone else. But they were having a conversation with that executive that here's what's not getting done and here's what we need to work on. And so that was one where the organization was open about it. I've certainly seen situations where people have just gotten ripped out and sent packing, but I don't think that's the norm at that level. I got to fire myself at one position, and a company that really didn't want a Silicon Valley presence, but they had acquired a Silicon Valley company. And so we had to work on a transition plan to an offshore location and transition what we had to do. And, you know, I wasn't part of that go forward plan because I wasn't going to go move to, you know, the country that we were moving the operations to and go do what needs to be done. So I was involved in that. And that was a good 6-month process to make sure that we did the right thing.
Interesting. Yeah, it's again, I know this is it's a tricky episode because we use stories. It's hard to generalize because, you know, there's probably you know, you're a billion different permutations of how this can go down, maybe more, and, you know, not every situation is unique. But I think a lot of what you've been saying is, I think, very applicable to probably a broad audience. And I guess one question that, you know, just maybe warrants asking is, when you are brought in from the outside and you're trying to bring in your own leadership style, right? So obviously that, I think, is a little bit tricky because sometimes maybe they're turning to an outside technology leader because of execution. Sometimes it's a leadership style thing. Maybe it's a different stage of company. You need different type of person. If somebody's turning to an outside hire because of any of those reasons, when it comes to the actual leadership style in the team, how do you balance coming into an organization trying to obviously understand, you're going to assess, you're going to take the time to understand what's going on, but you do have to make some changes or potential changes, and one of them could be style. How do you go through that process of that assessment and making sure the waves aren't big? And again, sometimes maybe the waves should be big, but I think a lot of people would say that big waves aren't good in most cases.
I generally think big waves are bad, right? You've got a lot of intelligent people that, whatever an organization you inherit, there's a lot of talent there, right? The business wouldn't exist if that talent didn't exist in the first place. So the company I mentioned previously, where I came in through an acquisition, and then we brought in a more senior SVP, this was an organization that had started small and had three really awesome people kind of running the show. We had a VP of product, we had a VP of engineering, and we had an architect. And I was brought in through the acquisition, like I said, so I was, VP 4 out of, a collection of them, and I was responsible for the San Jose office. But those three people literally sat down every day and sent out emails to everybody on the team to tell them what to do tomorrow, and tell them what to do tomorrow, and to tell them what to do tomorrow. And quite frankly, I'm not that smart. I want a more leveraged organization. I very much believe in servant leadership, where people writing the code are going to make better decisions than I'm going to make in the process. But when they brought in the new SVP, what we ended up doing was restructuring the team. So it was no longer flat, and we hit the culture change harder than the technology change, because I had spent a year as an architect trying to convince things. We should write code like this. We should write code like that. And in the end, I managed to rediscover Conway's Law, and in that process, realized it wasn't, we shouldn't spend all this time trying to convince people to architect the product a particular way. The org structure is going to end up naturally organizing the product a particular way. And it was a transformative moment for me to realize that somebody came in, and all they really did was have a bunch of discussions and lay down a new org chart. And based on that new org chart, the organization behaved a different way, and we got different results out of the organization. And I'm hugely grateful to have been part of that process, and to have been able to see it from the inside, and make it part of what I do when I go to an organization, is not start with the assumption that people don't know how to write code. Of course they know how to write code. I start with the assumption that they're not set up for success. And so what tweaks do you need to make to set people up for success? Which includes, if you find somebody in the organization that's frustrated that they didn't get the job that they just stuck you in, how do you set them up to grow so that they can be in that position at some point in the future, whether as your successor or as in their own organization when you move them into the next spot?
I guess, we've been talking a lot about the dynamics being hired from the outside, the implication to the existing staff, leadership decisions. When you're a technology leader and you're looking to be brought in to fill one of these gaps, are there things that you should be, well, there are things, but what should you be asking? What should you be looking for to make sure that you're walking into the right situation that you can execute and be successful? Because obviously, I think, every engineering leader, every technology leader's hoping to execute and be successful. But what can you look for? What can you ask?
As my career's gone on, I spend far more time focused on the culture than I do the technology. You can switch from C++ to Rust. You can switch from Java to Go, right? That's a tactical thing to go do. But what I want to know more than anything while I'm in the interview process is, do I have the latitude to go enact the changes? I have a style. Every leader has a style. I have a way that I am at my best. And so, is this an organization where I can be at my best and help the organization be at its best through the symbiotic relationship that we ultimately put together? And if it doesn't pass that test, if the organization has a particular set that just isn't going to move, then it's just going to be frustrating for everybody, and that's not going to work. So I kind of start there now and say, if the style I mentioned earlier into servant leadership, if the style of an enabled organization is one that in the interview process you think the organization is going to take well to, then great. I potentially the right person for the job. If it's a more traditional command and control structure, I'm probably not the right person for the job. And I no longer leave that up for chance where I say, oh, it's cool technology, or I like the sales, or I like something else. I want to be testing as much as anything. Is this an organization that I can be successful in? And I think the organization can be successful with me as the head of it.
I think I love that advice, and I think it's good to understand yourself in the leadership style that in an environment that's going to fit you. And I think that's actually really important as a part of the career process to actually understand what makes you tick and what makes you work optimally. I guess we're going to go back to the old adage, and I'm not going to I'm not worried about right or wrong, but it's being said that people leave jobs because of bad managers, right? I'm in the recruiting industry. I would argue people don't only leave jobs because of bad managers. They leave jobs because they feel like they don't have another place to go is one reason. It's an opportunity that they can't possibly get. When you are hiring from the outside, as an organization, other people are watching. So far, I think the conversation's been around, hey, other engineering leaders are paying attention, could impact them. But there is an implication that other people in the team, other people in the company, other people in the technology org are looking at this and going, well, does that mean that when I get to a certain level, I'm going to hit a potential ceiling because they look to bring in people from the outside? That's tricky because that's not probably fair to the company. But how does a company, and again, this is a big question, you might not have an answer, but when you're looking at the org and trying to make sure that people understand there is a career ladder and people have the opportunity to move up, when you do bring somebody in from the outside, it kind of speaks against that. And I think that's a tricky thing. Your thoughts on that?
Well, change equals opportunity. And, the opportunity to move into a VP of engineering role, there's only a couple of ways that's going to happen. That's going to happen because there was a succession plan and somebody was kind of groomed for that position and stuck into that position. If so, that's a conversation you've been having for a while. You need both opportunity and ability to step into a role. And so if a business is going to put you in the role, you've been groomed for it, and it, especially at that level. It'll happen as you potentially take another job on the outside. It can happen through an acquisition. It can happen through a merger. It can happen through any sort of change in the business plans. And it's needing to have demonstrated the abilities so you're in the right place at the right time. And there's more directors than there are VPs. And so as you get to that director level and you're looking to take that next step into the VP role, I've always enjoyed that conversation with folks. It's like, what do I need to do to get these things? Great. We can talk about what these skills are and make sure that they've been demonstrated. So if an opportunity does arise, there you go. You get to put somebody in the role. I had a unique experience where somebody who worked for me at one point in my career, I worked for them at another point in my career. Love it when you get somebody on a path where they're off having success. The Valley is a relatively small place, and we all move from job to job to job, and each one of those are opportunities.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it's again, generalizations are, this is a very tricky topic to do generalized, discussion, but I think the examples that you provide, I think a lot of them are fantastic because I think it's very situational. And I think it's good for people to hear that these dynamics, I'm sure they realize they're very complicated. They're very complex from the multifaceted view of the conversation. Steve, if somebody wants to reach out to you to actually ask you a little bit more depth on anything you talked about, because obviously there's probably different scenarios, and maybe somebody has a scenario they'd like to kind of ping you to discuss. Is there a good way of touching base with you?
LinkedIn is great. So Steve Van Lare on LinkedIn, or you can hit me up at Anjuna. Steve at Anjuna.io is another great way to get a hold of me.
Okay, fantastic, Steve. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on and talking with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on today.
Absolutely. That's it for the episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think, again, this conversation was more, I think, about example stories and talking about some different situations. I know we can't exhaust all those situations, and the generalized discussion wouldn't be as useful, but I think Steve provides some great insights in terms of how a lot of these situations might play out from various perspectives. So please share this with somebody else who might have to deal with this or is in this current situation. Reach out to Steve if you have a follow-up. I'm sure he is available to help provide his insights as well, as he left you a couple of ways to reach out to him. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Please follow the podcast if you don't. And let me know if there's any topics you'd like me to cover in the future. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.